this week's episode of the DeLuz Brothers. I'm David.
And I'm Craig. And this week we're going to be talking about affirmative action in the 21st century. Now recently, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld Michigan's ban on affirmative action when it comes to access to higher education. So we figured it'd be a good topic to cover this week.
Yeah, the question is affirmative action really needed today? And of course, my argument is that yes, we still need affirmative action, and even we really need race-based affirmative action.
And my position largely is there's nothing wrong with trying to work to create diversity as long as we're not instituting a quota system. So that's the frame for the debate. I hope you enjoy. Affirmative action, as it was originally created, was about righting a historical wrong. It was about creating a level playing field in terms of access to government jobs, government contracting, and higher education for those who had traditionally been denied for no other reason than the color of their skin. But instead, what was created was a quota system. A system that said we'll have a certain percentage of blacks, we'll have a certain percentage of whites, certain percentage of Latinos, Asians, women, whatever, in order to create diversity. But instead, what it wound up doing was creating a system that instead of ending discrimination, actually created discrimination by denying individuals the right to have access to these positions who were actually the most qualified applicants. Now, I'll be the first to say that we should be working to make sure that we create diversity, that we have government jobs and we have government institutions and schools that reflect the diversity in our society. But we ought not do that by discriminating against individuals who've actually earned the right to these positions.
President Johnson famously said that you can't take a man hobbled for years in chains, liberate him, and then place him at the starting line of a race and expect him to be able to compete with everyone else. That's not right. That's not how we do things in America. But that's exactly what we did after 250 years of slavery and another 100 years of Jim Crow. But then in 1941, beginning with President Roosevelt and on through the next 5 presidents, we created the policy of affirmative action. And what did it do? It didn't level the playing field entirely, but it created a more fair process for people of color and women to compete against their white male counterparts for jobs, for education, and for government contracting opportunities. What happened? You saw a growth in the black middle class. You saw more people going to college. You saw more people going to more black people going to elite institutions. It created a whole realm of opportunity for those who were prepared and qualified to take advantage. Affirmative action is not a quota system. Quotas are illegal. But I would argue that we need to continue to have an affirmative action policy even today because those opportunities are still needed by Americans. First question from the Noop, Kelly.
Yo, yo.
Your question goes first. Okay, here we go. Why do white males approach affirmative action as though all things are equal?
Okay, well, first of all, understand that since the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which you and I have actually grown up under, we're all equal under the law. And I think a lot of folks believe that because we're in fact equal under law, well, then that creates equality. Well, the reality is things aren't fair. You know that. Dad, and your dad had raised us. He taught us, he said, sons, life isn't fair. Right. So you might have to work twice as hard as somebody else in order to get ahead. But that's just a reality. First of all, life isn't fair. I think there are a lot of folks who would agree that there has not been equal access to higher education or to government jobs or government contracting. But I think everyone can agree that over time that has improved. Even post-2009, post-affirmative action in the state of California, that access has in fact improved. The question we have to ask ourselves is that when we put something in place that's supposed to be a fix, at what point do we determine that it's either a hindrance or even worse, at what point do we determine that, look, the fix has now been done, right, and it's time to now eliminate that policy that was simply meant to be a temporary thing. And I think that the challenge is that there are many folks who believe that something that was supposed to be temporary ought to be permanent. And in this particular case, when you look at it, those who are not getting access to higher education, it's not because of race. It's not because they're black. It's not because they're Latino. Now, there may be a number of of factors that are there, but there's no law against those against accounting for those factors. Growing up in a single parent household, not having parents that have gone to college, being low income. These are all things that are still legally can be included as factors when it comes to access to higher education or government jobs or contracting. So I think that's why people believe that it's actually equal, or at least come across like they believe it's equal. Okay, David, now we've got a question for you. And this question comes from Daniel. And he asks that when it comes to colleges and universities, should they drop their standards in order to accommodate race or racial diversity? And shouldn't the social construct aside, should achievement be the primary goal?
Well, to the second part of your question, yes, achievement should be the primary goal. But I would argue that you can get there in a number of different ways. So I would argue that lowering the standard is not the answer, but changing the things that you look at to measure achievement, I think, is the way to go here. My challenge is that we rely too much on standardized tests and we rely too much on GPAs, which have the ability in some communities to be inflated and create an artificial sense of superiority from one student to the other. You can have, and you know this as well as I do, you can have a student that took all the top classes they could in their school, but they wouldn't be able to compete with someone who went to another school who had more access to AP courses or that had other services on that campus that allowed them to that helped them to get better grades or better test scores. So I would argue, Daniel, that instead of lowering the standards, first of all, understand this. Private institutions can do whatever they want. They can set whatever standards they want and look at whatever factors they desire to look at. State institutions like UC and CSU, they actually do not admit anyone who meets the eligibility requirements, the minimum eligibility requirements of CSU or UC. So everyone that's admitted technically is qualified. The question then becomes, how do you allocate the slots to particularly our what do they call the cream of the crop schools, UC Berkeley, UCLA, or Cal Poly, where I went to school. Go Mustangs! But the point here is that I would argue that lowering the standards is not the way to go, but changing what we look at is. Why are you so dead set against affirmative action?
Well, I'm not dead set against affirmative action. I mean, the concept of affirmative action is not a bad one, but it's when you start talking about trying to end discrimination by discriminating. And that's in essence what it's become now, is I may have someone who's white, who comes from lower socioeconomic status, who was raised in a single parent household, or who's a foster child, and that student won't get access to a position for an African American or a Latino who comes from a two-parent household whose parents are reasonably wealthy. My point is the way in which affirmative action has been put in place, it's become less about the intent, which was creating diversity, and more about how bureaucrats go about doing it and about fulfilling quotas, about saying, okay, we got to make sure that we've got a certain number of African Americans, we got a certain number of Latinos, we got a certain number of women, and we're going to do whatever we can do to skew the numbers in order to make sure we're there.
Okay, first of all, quotas are illegal. You can't do
Well,
quotas.
they're illegal now.
let's just set that aside.
They weren't illegal before. Before Prop 209, they weren't illegal.
No, they weren't. And you know who started it? It was your boy Richard Tricky Dick Nixon that created through the Philadelphia plan, created goals and timetables, which
there are plenty of
folks turned into quotas.
There are plenty of conservatives who will tell you that Dick Nixon was not the most conservative president that was out there.
I understand.
But no, you are right. In terms of quotas, in terms of not so much quotas, but timetables and standards were in fact originally instituted by Richard Nixon.
But the challenge that I have with the whole argument about ending affirmative action is that no one's come up with a better alternative. What's the better alternative out there?
Well, but David, the problem is that when everyone always says amend it, don't end it. And I, my issue was that when people came up with ideas to amend it, they were shot down. They were where there's no way, we're not going to amend it, we're not going to change it. We're not going to start talking about, how about instead of saying, okay, well, we're going to do it based on race, let's just focus on socioeconomic status. Let's focus on first-generation college attendees.
That proposal
Let's focus on low
never
income.
come before the legislature in California.
People have discussed it.
Where is it?
It's been discussed. Conservatives have been saying it for a while. In fact, that's what we actually have right now. That's what we have in the state of California, where those things are allowed to be considered. And guess what? In the UC system as well as the CSU system, well, I don't know about the CSU, but I know for sure in the UC system, we've actually seen enrollment go up. But guess what we also saw go up? We saw graduation rates amongst ethnic minorities, Latinos and African Americans increase significantly in the UC system and in the CSU system. Once you started creating a position where students who were actually, I don't know, prepared and qualified to be there, were allowed access.
But you also saw that could also be explained away by the growth in the number of high school students that were also
actually no.
Yes,
the growth in terms of enrollment and the growth in terms of graduation rates far outpaced the growth in terms of population. So no, that's not true.
That's not true.
That is not true.
All right.
I'll post. Matter of fact, folks, there will be a link on the Facebook page.
I'll be looking for that link too.
To the study that I'm discussing.
Yeah, I'd like to see that study.
But Dave, the difference was this, and here's what happened. And I saw this in my experience when I was at Chico. When I would work with the summer program, one of the things that wound up happening was you had students who would come to college who were bright and intelligent, right, but were not prepared to be there. They didn't know how to write a 5-paragraph essay. They didn't know how to, in some cases, how to add, multiply, and divide fractions. They were set up in a position where they go in, they take the entry-level math exam and the English placement test, and they were put in a position where they were remedial. And so now they've got to take these remedial classes along with their regular core classes. They're in a new community, new environment. Everything is new. And in many cases, these students were set up to fail.
I agree. My argument, though, is that there's a way to do this. There is a way to do this, and the Ivy Leagues have pointed the way. The Ivy Leagues and other elite institutions have pointed in a direction that if you create support systems for those students, because remember, these are students who are not, it's not that they're not qualified for for higher education. They're not qualified. It's not that they're not qualified even for that institution. It's that they are, given the number of people who are competing for the position, their positions, they may not necessarily be the highest qualified, but they're still qualified to be there.
David, there was one year it was noted that 68% of African American students needed remediation in either math, English, or both. Now, remediation basically means that you didn't get what it was that you were supposed to get in high school in order to be prepared to achieve on the college level.
Based on their test scores and based on their GPA, they were eligible for admission to CSU or the UC. Now, because they took the ELM or the EPT that said they weren't necessarily ready, to meet those standards, they were still eligible for admission to the university. If there were more systems, because Craig,
under the current system, you're right, but under the
Right.
previous system, under the pre-209 system, that was not the case.
well, what was not the case?
That they were necessarily eligible.
That's not true. That is not true. You have to be eligible in order to be considered under any federal affirmative action policy. And mind you, the CSU and the UC,
And I'm sure that that's exactly how it was applied.
that's the law. I can't argue. I mean, I wasn't there. I was a student. I wasn't there in the admissions office, but I know what the law says. And the law says that to be even considered, you have to be a qualified candidate. You may not be the highest qualified candidate, but you're still qualified. So I don't necessarily want to hear the argument, well, there's people that are more qualified than others. Well, I would argue that there are some folks who got C's on their report card, but had to navigate drug dens and gang sets and had to work and had to catch the bus to
So
and
you're
from
making an
school
assumption.
2 hours.
You're making an
I would
assumption
say
that
those people,
because they were
I would
black
say
and
that those
Latino,
people-
that's the life they live.
I would say
right?
that those people.
So you're saying
had
because they're black and
people that
Latino,
had to
that's
work,
the life they live.
People that had to work, people that had.
You're saying because they're
people
black
that
and
were-
Latino. I have no problem if you're talking about that. If those are the considerations, but you're saying just because they're black or they're Latino, that they must have had to deal with that.
That's not all I'm saying.
I know that's not the life
That's
that
not
I grew
all
up
I'm
with.
saying, Craig. That's not what I'm saying. You're playing the
what
race
you're saying.
card. You're playing the race
No,
card.
you're playing the way.
No,
you're
I'm
saying
not.
we need
I'm saying-
You're saying we need affirmative action because
Craig.
these kids have gone through drug dens and they've had to
Some
work
of them
and grow up
have.
and
Some of them
and some
have.
white kids have, some Latinos have,
Maybe.
some Asians
Maybe.
have. So why are we discriminating
But
against
there's not-
those kids who've gone through that?
There's not the institutional racism piece with the white kids because those white kids can go out and get a job.
So wait. So now you brought up the fact. Okay, so this whole thing started in 1941. So at what point do we say once we are now equal under the law? Because like I said, you and I have grown up, and we're the first generation to grow up equal under the law. So my question is, at what point do we say that we need to eliminate these things? Because you said in your opening statement that this is not about equality or quality of outcome, but that seems to be exactly what we're looking for. Not equality of opportunity, but equality of outcome.
No,
and
I still think
we'll never get equality of outcome.
I don't think you're looking for equality of outcome. I still think you're looking for equality of opportunity, Craig. But you don't battle 350 years of state-sponsored racism and discrimination that created economic winners and losers through policies that promoted education, that promoted housing, that promoted jobs, that promoted businesses through loans and other vehicles of policy that created opportunity for some class of people that another class of people did not have access to. You don't negate that 350 years of history with a 50-year window of opportunity. Wealth is accumulated over generations. Opportunity is accumulated over generations. We're not there yet. We've gone through. You said hold on. You said we are the first. We are the first folks to grow up in
equal under the law.
Equal under the law. One generation. Your son, our sons, are the second generation to grow up in that.
David,
but you're talking seven, eight generations.
My point though is that if we can look at it and we realize that lack of access in these cases isn't because of their race, but because of these other determining factors that may be indicative or consistent amongst certain ethnic groups. Why not focus on those items? Why not focus on poverty? Why not focus on single parent household? Why not focus on first generation college attendees? Why not focus on those things as opposed to race?
I would argue that those things and race should all be considered. I think it should all be considered. You can't just negate the impact of race and racial discrimination, because, Craig, there were public policies that were created in this country based on race that created winners
those
and
policies
losers.
don't exist anymore.
But the
those
impacts
policies
do.
don't exist
the
anymore.
impacts of those policies do.
So in other words, two wrongs make a right. So in other words, because we discriminated in the past, we ought to discriminate now and into the future.
How else do you create?
Two wrongs don't, David. Two wrongs don't make a right, because what inevitably what happens is the pendulum goes from swinging one direction to swinging the other direction to where there is an injustice on the other side. Well, there it is, folks. You've heard the discussion. Now it's time for you to chime in.
So which one of us won the debate? Is it me, who was arguing that affirmative action is still needed and that race should still be a factor in consideration?
Or do you believe that I was correct in that we ought to make sure that if whatever we decide to do in order to promote diversity, it ought not include this quota systems that we've had in the past?
Affirmative action is not a quota. You can't do that. I keep trying to tell this guy. He doesn't
Well,
want to listen.
that's what they did. So anyway, y'all chime on in. Go to the website DeLuzBrothers.com and do us a favor. Invite your friends to come and watch it. Invite your friends to check it out. I think they'll find it interesting. So share it on Facebook, share it on Twitter, and we'll look forward to talking to you guys next week.
The DeLuz Brothers. Make sure you catch us.
All right, take care.
All right.